Hello, everyone. Hello. I wish I could whistle, but I can't. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mona El-Tahawi. It is a thrill to be introducing two people that need no introduction, but who, for me, have been names that I have long been proud of. Reading Khaled Hosseini's name, reading Firoozeh Dumas's name, and feeling especially proud of names that sound like mine and names that sound like my relatives and names that so represent the best of the Middle East has been a long source of pride. So I'm thrilled to be introducing them today. Khaled Hosseini, as many of you know, is the author of The Kite Runner and A Thousand Splendid Sons. And in 2008, this is especially important for me to point out, he launched the Khaled Hosseini Foundation, which is a wonderful reminder of how art and culture and literature can be used to channel this wonderful sense of humanity that we feel when we're touched by human stories and send it back to people home, our people, and help them and use the arts and the importance of the arts in this way. So I urge those of you who don't know about the Khaled Hosseini Foundation to look it up and find out how you can help beyond just reading Khaled's wonderful books. And Firoozeh Dumas is the author of Funny in Farsi and Laughing Without an Accent. Funny in Farsi was, many of the essays there were in our readers' retreat. And the wonderful thing there, and if there's anyone involved in television out there, is that based on Funny in Farsi, ABC commissioned a pilot. And it would have been the first pilot on American television, network television, about a Middle East family, but they did not have the guts to go through with it. So those of you with clout in the TV world, go out there and tell ABC, shame on you, we want a Middle East sitcom. Oh, okay. Khaled's chosen word would have been cojones. So ABC did not have the balls to go through it. I thought I would just leave, the interesting anatomy to your interview here. So I'm going to get off now and let Firoozeh and Khaled delight us in this meeting. Enjoy.
Well, thank you, Mona. I met Khaled in January of 2004 at the Berkeley Public Library annual fundraiser. And what it was there's about 15 authors invited, and it's a dinner, and people pay to eat, to sit at the table with their favorite author. Now, the big name that year was not Khaled. It was, do you remember?
The man with the fez hat.
The man with the fez hat, Michael Chabon. And he's still a big name. Still big.
He's the man.
He's the man. And so I went to this event with my husband, and right away, when we walked in the door, we're going right towards like the seared ahi hors d'oeuvres, and Khaled and his wife Roya came up to me, and Khaled said, oh, I've read Funny in Farsi, I laugh so much, blah, blah. And I had not yet read The Kite Runner. However, I had read, well, I did read it though later.
You acted like you had. So.
But here's the thing, though. I had seen his name everywhere because it was really widely reviewed. And the fact that somebody named Khaled Hosseini was getting positive press, I was like, you go, bro. I mean, I don't care what he'd written. It's, usually names like Khaled you see on other lists. So I was so happy.
It's true. It's true. I'm cursed. That's true.
So anyways, we chatted quite a bit, and then we decided that we'd get together with our spouses, and of course, the question is, where do two Afghanis, an Iranian, and a Frenchman go for dinner? And I suggested sushi, but we ended up going to an Afghani restaurant. And after that, we got together with our families and basically became friends. Now, Iran and Afghanistan are not only neighboring countries, but what we have in common is a shared language. I speak Farsi, and Khaled speaks Dari, which are very similar. It's analogous to the French spoken in France versus the French spoken in Canada. Khaled's, of course, being the Canadian French. And
it's a whole other debate.
our foods are similar. So for me, it was just a sort of instant connection with Khaled. Now, at the time, The Kite Runner, was doing well, but, like a lot of other books, but it wasn't like phenomenal or anything. And then it went into paperback, and I don't know what happened. It was like, all of a sudden it was everywhere. Like every newspaper you picked up, every magazine, everything was The Kite Runner, The Kite Runner. It was amazing. And I was following, okay, I have to admit, I tended to check my Amazon rankings every hour on the hour. But, so I was also checking his. And then at one point, I emailed him and I was like, Khaled, you're not gonna believe this, but you are down to 3 digits on Amazon. And then like the next day I was like, guess what? You're down to 2 digits on Amazon. And then, like a day later, I was like, I sent, and there were so many exclamation points in these emails. And then when it hit #1 on Amazon, it just, it was broken. It just stuck there. And my father, my father, who also follows my Amazon rankings and actually writes them on these yellow pads, he's retired, so there's a lot of free time. But he called me up one day and he said, guess what? I'm following your Afghani friend, because there's so much more action on his ranking. So, anyways, so Khaled, let's go back to when I met you, when you were still a physician at Kaiser Permanente, and the writing you were doing was basically prescriptions for Lipitor, probably.
No, that wasn't on formulary, so we had to prescribe Mevacor, actually.
Oh, really? Well, anyways, when were you actually writing your stories?
For a minute there, I thought this was going to be like the easiest interview ever. What was the question again?
So when you were working as a doctor, when were you working on your stories?
So when I was working as a doctor, I worked on the Kite Runner early in the morning because I'm a morning person. I love morning time. So I came up with the idea of writing this novel, but I was working full time, seeing patients, and so I just can't work in the evening. I had a family life and so on. So I basically was like, the only time I have is early in the morning. So I started just setting my alarm clock to 4:30. I'd get up. I start to write around 5, and I'd write till about 8, and then I would have to clean up and everything, and then go to work and see my patients, and then the next morning do the same thing. So the bulk of that novel was written in those wee hours in the morning, and I can't believe how fast I wrote that book. I mean, I wrote that thing in like 15 months, which I would kill for.
Now, did you have anybody read your stories while you were writing, or what was your process?
Did somebody read my
Yeah.
stories? Well, at the time, I belonged to a writer's workshop called the San Francisco Writers Workshop, which has been meeting for like 50 years. It's a shifting cast of characters. Every week is, there's a few regulars, and it was led by my friend, Tamim Ansari, who had authored a book called West of Kabul, East of New York. So I started driving to San Francisco on Tuesdays and read portions of the Kite Runner in that group. And you could read like 6 pages, and then people would give you feedback. And the feedback was very good, mostly. And so I got encouraged, and I kept writing it. Roya, my wife, is my editor at home. She's an amazing editor. I actually didn't know what a good editor she was, like until a couple of years into our marriage, or maybe even later, where I found one of my stories full of red marks, and I was like, who did this? And it was Roya had edited the story. So she reads everything that I write and edits it, and then I go from there. It's a tricky business to, I don't know if Francois reads your writing at home?
No. My husband, see, I'm a perfectionist when I write, and so I will write and rewrite and rewrite, and I will just change one word. And so I would give him 2 versions with 1 word different. And then he would read it and say, they're the same. And I'll say, no, they're not. In here I said the street was wide, and I said here I said it was big.
Of course.
And he's like, it's the same. So,
yeah.
No.
So no, I understand.
No, I wish Roya were my wife, okay? That's all I can say.
The danger of having a spouse or a family member edit your writing is that they feel a pressure to be nice. And that's the worst thing for a writer, is somebody who's like, afraid to tell you the truth. Roya is not. Sometimes I could use, she will cross a full page of red mark. This is actually in the early days. Either she's just softened with time, or I've become a better writer, because lately I don't see those LOL exclamation mark, the X's across the page anymore. Now it's like a couple of things here and there. But the flip side of it was that when she loved something, then I knew that had value, that I was onto something, because she tells me the truth.
Now, did you ever think of just being a writer? I mean, not going to medical school and all that?
No, I mean, it would have been, the notion was laughable to me. I never imagined that can be a writer. I mean, I love writing from the time that I was a kid. The little story in The Kite Runner about the boy who finds this, this cup, this magic cup, and the tears turn into pearls. And so that story, I wrote that in Kabul when I was like 9 years old, I think, and I put it in the novel. But I love writing. I never imagined I would ever be a writer. I mean, I actually never even considered it, although privately, probably deep inside, consciously, it was my dream. But I just thought writers were people who belonged in a different parallel universe. And then there was us, and we admired the work that they did, and we read him, but you don't aspire. It was like, the gods. So, even when we came to the States, I was 15, and at that time, the idea of becoming a writer was ridiculous because I didn't speak a word of English. So the idea that I would become a writer in a language I didn't even speak, and I would become such a good writer that I could make a living from it, I mean, it was just outlandish. So even after The Kite Runner was published, I refused to call myself a writer because I figured I've written a novel that's out there, people are going to read it, I'm going to keep seeing my patients, and life goes on. And it really wasn't until, your emails with Amazon and all that, where I started to scratch my head, and I said, well, maybe I can make a living from this. And then the little thing that told me that God is sending me a message that, maybe I should start thinking about this as a career, was one day I was flipping the channels, and I turned the channel just in time to find myself as the answer to a Jeopardy question. And at that point, I said, okay, I get it, all right. So maybe I'll give this gig a longer shot. So I went to my employers at Kaiser, and I said, look, you guys, why don't I take a year off? Because I'm writing a second book, and I need time to write it. And they gave me the year, and at the end of the year, I still wasn't done. And I was really enjoying my time off, and I went back, and I said, another year, and they said, you have to resign now or come back. So I resigned, and that was like in December of '04. I haven't gone back since.
So do you think that anybody can write?
No.
No?
No, I mean, it sounds horrible. But it's not. I don't say that with arrogance, but I truly believe that there are people who have, from a very young age, a voice in their head, a compulsion. People say, why did you choose to write? Often they ask me, why did you choose to write? The question is difficult to answer because there's a presumption that there was choice involved. I always felt compelled to write. I always felt compelled to create things and to tell stories. And that's what and I was the happiest when I surrendered to that compulsion. So there was never any question as to what I really loved doing. I don't think you become a writer. I think you're born one. And then you become a better writer through writing and, of course, through reading and through, honing your skill. And, of course, there's writing programs, MFAs, and so on and so forth. Like, I don't think people go into MFAs to become writers. I think they're all writers going in, and they just come out better writers. You don't go in a non-writer, and then become a writer through an MFA program. I just don't believe that.
Now, I just want to set the record clear on this because I don't know how many times I've answered this question to other people. The Kite Runner is not, it's a work of fiction.
Let's address that right now, yes.
What parts of the Kite Runner are true?
Oh, it's very hard for me to tease and extricate what's real and what's not because there's bits and pieces of you or shades of you on the page, and there's places where there's a little bit of you and not a lot. So it's hard for me to say exactly like that. But what I will say is that the life that Amir led in Kabul is very similar to mine that I had when I was growing up in Afghanistan. I grew up in the same era as he did, pre-Soviet War, 1970s in Afghanistan. I grew up with the same socioeconomic background. My father was working for the foreign ministry. My mom taught Farsi and history at a very large high school for girls. So we were in that socioeconomic background. I went to the same school he did. I loved writing as a boy as he did. I loved films as he did. I loved flying kites, and that was like something we all did as boys in Kabul is fly kites, entire winters of running through the streets and flying kites from rooftops. So there's a lot of my life on those pages. The actual storyline of what happens between Amir and Hassan, not really. The middle of the novel, when Amir and Baba come to California, and they're trying to make a life, make a go of it in Northern California and go into the flea market. That resembles my life a lot more, although I didn't meet Roy at a flea market. But you know, my dad and I would go, my dad had bought this rickety old van, and he and I on Saturdays would drive up and down the peninsula. We'd go to all these garage sales, and we'd buy like tennis rackets and, you know, old Nike tennis shoes and jackets and whatever. And then on the next day, on Sunday, we would go to the San Jose flea market, and then we would set up, you know, on the ground a little booth, and we would sell it for a little bit of profit. And the funny thing was that there was an entire aisles of Afghan people who were doing the same thing. And all these people that were there, they were, you know, they were acquaintances, or in some cases, friends of the friends that my folks knew from Kabul, former colleagues of my father's at the foreign ministry, former college professors, people who were engineers and so on, and they were all selling junk at the flea market. So it was this kind of little microcosm for the Afghan society in exile, which I thought was just such a good encapsulated little world that I could write for that middle of the book. So that section of it, more than anything.
Well, you know, your books have really humanized Afghanis for so many people in the world who really knew nothing about Afghanistan. So you're one of the few people who actually travels there now. What changes have you seen in the past 10 years since the U.S. has been in
Well, when
Afghanistan?
I went to Kabul the first time in 2003, and I had left as a boy in 1976. When I was 11, we went to Paris and never returned. Came to the States at 15. I went back 27 years later. I was 38 at the time, and had 2 children already. And when I got to Kabul the first day, I was, you know, completely stunned, because I left Kabul in the 70s. You know, when I say the word Kabul, maybe it's probably worth mentioning that when I say the word Kabul, now there's a certain image that people have. You know, people think, oh, suicide bombings, you know, terrorist attacks, Taliban, and so on. But in the 70s, Kabul was actually a very cool place. There was, you know, it was a cosmopolitan city. There were theaters and cinemas and restaurants. And there was, for a conservative Muslim society, it was surprisingly liberal. There were nightclubs, and you know, women walked around both in burqa and not. And it was actually a lovely, and I have very fond memories of Kabul. When I went back in 2003, it was a war zone. I mean, it was a shock to see entire neighborhoods just decimated, houses just razed to the ground, every building with massive holes in it like this, potholes everywhere, so crowded, so polluted, so many people walking around, hopping around on one leg, so many widows, the widows and the orphans. I couldn't believe. It was like I said in The Kite Runner, it was like you had this amazing childhood friend, and then you run into them 27 years later, and they're homeless, and they're destitute, and they're so riddled skin, and they're sick, and just in horrible shape. And it just kind of really wrenched my heart. And it took me several days to really adjust to this reality, which of course I knew from TV and newspapers, but to walk the streets, see with your own eyes the streets of your childhood, and to see the transformation was really shattering. So that was my first time that I went back.
Have you ever considered taking your clout that you have and directing it towards guiding foreign policy in that area, U.S. foreign policy?
No, I don't think that's my position, nor anything to my liking. I don't feel that I have the specific talent or drive that it takes to do that. Foreign policy, when you get into politics, you end up being put in positions where you have to make a lot of compromises that you otherwise might not want to make. I see my role as a writer. It's what I love to do. And somebody asked me if I was going to run for president in Afghanistan. And once I was done laughing, I was like, no. No, I'm not interested in affecting foreign policy. Although, what I will say is, through the process of speaking about Afghanistan and speaking about the will and the aspirations of Afghan people as I understand it to be, and trying to be an advocate for those people in Afghanistan who are voiceless, who are faceless, whose stories have been trampled upon in the bigger narrative of war and destruction. I think that does hopefully shape people's decision-making to some extent. I don't have any illusions about my influence at all, but I think it does make people think twice, and I think that's a good thing. I think for a lot of people in the West, Afghanistan was just like this. I get letters. I said Afghanistan was just this chronically troubled nation that was always seemed to be at war. But because of my books, I think of it differently now. My readers do. And so does that mean something? Does that affect foreign policy? I don't know. But that's not something that I willfully seek.
And in your travels and during the past 10 years, what have you noticed positive changes?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that ought to be said and is not said enough. You know, every story about Afghanistan is just ubiquitous with how grim and depressing and negative it is. And there is a lot to be depressed about, make no mistake. Afghanistan has serious challenges ahead. But look, for instance, Kabul looks nothing like what it did in the way I described it in 2003. You know, 4,000 kilometers of road have been rebuilt, 2,000 schools have been built. When the Taliban were in Afghanistan, 1 million kids were going to school. Overwhelmingly, they were boys. Now, some 7 million kids have gone back to school, 35% of them girls. You know, when the Taliban were in power, only 8% of people had access to health care. Now more than 80% do. Infant mortality has been dropped by 25%. Not to mention the fact that, you know, we have women back in the fold, at least in Kabul. You know, 25% of the seats of the lower house in the parliament are occupied by women. These are significant improvements, and although they may not seem sexy or really theatrical to people in the West, to people on the street, it's a big deal. Now, that doesn't mean that they're satisfied with everything. I'm not saying that, but there has been improvement, and that improvement has been achieved with blood and with loss of life and limb, with a lot of money, with a lot of sacrifice on both sides. And I think that is what's hanging in the balance today as we're pondering, you know, as we're entering the beginning of this end game and pondering the future.
Now, what was the impetus for starting your nonprofit? Was it your trips there?
My trips, yeah, and I love Afghanistan. They're my people. I love Afghan people, and when I go to Afghanistan, my heart breaks for what I see. I feel for them. And I feel I'm so fortunate, you know. I'm very lucky. I mean, I might be the luckiest Afghan of all time, considering how things have turned out for me. And every time I go to Afghanistan and the plane is entering Afghan airspace, I feel something. And when the plane approaches Kabul, and it's not a pretty place, you know. I mean, you see all the brown, the dust, and everything. I almost tear up, and I say, I was born down there. Those people down there, they have my blood, they speak my language, they're my people, and I'm about to go back to them. I just love it, love going back. And so I want to give something of myself. I want to extend my own good fortune to these people that I love. You know, I have no illusions that I'm changing the world or making their life and I'm fixing everything. There are no humanitarian solutions for those big problems. But I would feel, I could not look myself in the mirror if I said, you know, you in the position that you are, with the access that you have, with the people that actually listen, or certain people listen to what you say, and you do nothing, you know, you should be ashamed of yourself. And so I see it as both as something that I feel passionate about, and also, frankly, as a duty.
So can you share with us what exactly your foundation does?
Well, when I started the foundation, I said, who are the people who truly are the most vulnerable? You know, it's not the men in Afghanistan. You know, it's always women, young girls, and children. They're the ones that get hit the hardest. And so we've focused our efforts through the foundation on women and children. primarily refugees. I've been a spokesperson for UN Refugee Agency for about, about 5 years now. And we focused our efforts on providing help to returning refugees. If I may just tell a quick story, when I went in 2007, I returned to Afghanistan with the UN. And we visited settlements of Afghan refugees who'd come back. Now, just a couple of words about Afghan refugees. A lot of these people had lived in Pakistan for 10, 15, 20 years, okay? But Afghans love their country. If you listen to Afghan music, if you listen to Afghan poetry, the theme is always loss of homeland, return to homeland, and it's like these love letters written to Afghanistan and to returning to your home. And so Afghans return en masse to Afghanistan once the Taliban fell with great dreams, with great hopes, buoyed by aspirations of rebuilding the country. But life for people who return to Afghanistan is very difficult. It's very difficult to reintegrate for these refugees in a country in which human capital has been decimated, where entire state apparatus has collapsed, 30 years of conflict, brutality, massive human suffering, and a country that was one of the poorest nations in the world before all this happened. And so you can imagine that for people coming back, it's so hard to get started. And so I went to these settlements, and I saw these returnees living out in the open, you know, in sort of these makeshift shelters, kids running around. And I was speaking to one of the elders, and the thing that kind of really struck me was how casually he just said, you know, every winter we lose 3, 4, 5 kids because they just freeze. You know, and he showed me, he goes, I want to show you where we live. And he took my hand and he took me to this place, and it was a underground shelter. It was like, essentially it was a hole in the ground that they had built. And it was about the size of the stage. And the walls were about this high, and there was like one window at the very top, and that was it. And he goes, 22 people, 22 of us have spent the last 4 winters in this hole. And so I was very moved, and then when I returned home, I said, you know, let's work on shelter. And the UN Refugee Agency has an existing shelter program in Afghanistan. They've built shelters for over 1.2 billion people, and so we decided to focus the bulk of our funding towards the building of shelters for returnees, so that they're not homeless, and therefore they can, once they have a home, they can attend to their other needs.
Now, when I woke up, was a few months ago, and I saw the headlines about the allegations against Greg Mortensen, I thought of you and your nonprofit.
Yeah.
Has that affected?
Too early to say, but I think it will have some effect, and that's a bit of a tragedy, because the people who really suffer are those people that we're trying to help, and so I'm saddened by the whole Greg thing. Somebody will have to really convince me that Greg is not a man of conviction, but I still believe he is.
There's still allegations. I mean, so that, you know, nothing's been proven yet.
Nothing's been proven, but there's a lot of, you know, the public opinion court is a whole other issue. And so there are a lot of people in the public court have already tried and everything. But, you know, I think in his heart, he truly feels passion for those children, and he truly did want to help them. And Greg has made some mistakes. There's no question about it. He's a humanitarian, but he's a horrible director. You know, he's not organized. He hasn't conducted the organization with the existing traditional business model. So those are things that he has to work on. But I think his central message, that education is one very strong component of peace building, I think it still resonates, and I think it's still true.
And for people who are perhaps hesitant to donate to a nonprofit now, because out of fear of maybe the money's not going to go there, how do you address that?
Well, I feel...
I mean, I know you. You're one of those honest people I know. So, I mean, you can really trust them.
No.
But still,
there you go.
You know.
No.
What more can you ask for? Endorsement from me. Done.
No, I mean, I'm very sensitive to that, because I think those are legitimate questions. And my foundation is as transparent as it can get. We publish extensive information on our finances, on our operations, and it's readily available. We go through an exhausting vetting process when we get requests for grants. I think sometimes too exhausting. We've turned away people that I think we should have supported, but through discussions, I agreed that maybe it's not the best thing. And I've built a firewall between myself and the foundation so that I travel all over the country and give talks. And I'm fortunate enough, because of the sales of my books, that I get an honorarium. But every last cent of the honorarium goes to the foundation. In fact, the checks are made out to the foundation and not to me. So I don't benefit at all from donor money. I never sell books at events. If books are sold, it's at the request of the hosts, and then I calculate what my royalties would have been, and we donate that to the foundation. So I feel very confident and very comfortable with the way we've conducted the foundation.
Now, if there's one thing that you would want Americans to know about the Afghani people that they don't know, what would you want them to know?
There's more than one. I think one of the things about Afghanistan, it has fallen victim to a whole slew of myths that keep getting propagated. And some of them really get under my skin. For instance, if you read the paper, you always read that Afghanistan, why are we trying to help these people? It's a country stuck in the 13th century. In the Stone Age, sometimes they say. You've heard that. I'm sure everybody's read that. But that's not consistent with the reality that I see on the ground. That's a very condescending thing to say. When you go to Afghanistan, I tell you a little story and then you be the judge. I went to a remote village in Afghanistan, and it took us an hour to get there, and it was on top of this mountain. And you had to go around this road, hugging along the side of the mountain. So we finally got up there, and it's this little village of Hazara people who'd come back from Iran, and they were trying to make a go of it by growing wild pistachio trees. By growing pistachio trees, that's what animal husbandry had been their trade. And so we walked through the village and everything, and at the end of it, the shaky, kind of tottery little old man came up to me and very respectfully introduced himself as the mullah in the village. And he said, I also double as the teacher. But when you go and meet Mr. Karzai, he thought I was a big administrative government big shot. And he goes, when you go back to Kabul and meet with Mr. Karzai, I want you to give him this note. And in that note, he had written that we need in this village a school, and we want in this school computers so that our children can have access to the internet and can learn about the world and can become educated. Now that, to me, is not a country stuck in the 13th century. 12.5 million people have cell phones. In the most remote areas you go, people conduct business by calling each other, and they have cell phones, and by the way, the reception is amazing. There's tremendous commerce and enterprise. It's a nation of young people. Like over 60% of the country is under the age of 25. It's a country of young, industrious, capable people who are resourceful, and they're proud, looking forward to rebuilding the country. Yes, there are parts of Afghanistan that you look at on a superficial level and say, that just looks medieval. But I think that's a very surface level way of looking at it, and it's a lazy way of describing a country through this kind of a broad stroke brush, and you really have to. Another myth that really gets under my nerves is to say that there'll never be peace in Afghanistan because they're tribal people, Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, and they're warriors. But that's not true either, because Afghans are tribal people, but Afghans don't see the tribal differences. They take pride in that diversity. Yeah, they've had their differences, and there's been competition, and we've had even a militia war that was lined along ethnic. But if you look at the history of Afghanistan, Afghans have a strong sense of national identity. Whether they're Tajik, whether they're Uzbek, whether they're Pashtun, they think of themselves as Afghans first. Okay, so this, I think, is a fallacy. And to say that they're warriors, Afghanistan was at peace for the entirety of the 20th century while the West engaged in one world war after another, created millions and millions and millions of victims and refugees and one global crisis after another, while Afghanistan peacefully and quietly went about its business at peace with itself and with its neighbors. It was not until the Soviets invaded Afghanistan that they forced the Afghan hand into war. We should not forget that. The Afghans were minding their own business, and they were at peace, and they weren't fighting anybody. So that one makes me very angry when people say that. And another one that is, now you got me going. People, I read in the paper always that Afghans just are dependent and they want us to rebuild their country, and they're not grateful for what we've done. That's not true at all. Afghans are very grateful to the Americans and to the other nations have taken part in this operation. Are they blindly grateful? No. They understand the complexity of the situation and they have their complaints, as they should. But they're still grateful for the monies that have been poured in and for the support that has been given. And they don't want the world to rebuild their country. That's not true. They want to rebuild their own country. They're not asking for handouts. It's not a nation of beggars. They want the economic and the civic space to rebuild their own country, a little stability and security so they can rebuild their own country. You give an Afghan a stick of gum, he'll make a business out of it. So they don't need, all. So that also, I think, is something that keeps getting propagated through, especially through the media, and it's just not true.
Now, do you feel optimistic that after the U.S. troops leave Afghanistan, that the country will be able to rebuild?
I have my anxieties. I think all Afghans do. I mean, I'm a hopeful person, and I think ultimately Afghans will find Afghan solutions to their problems, and down the line things will be okay. But I have to admit that this is a period of anxiety for a lot of Afghans. The primary job of a state is to protect its citizens. That's priority number one. In other words, to exert a monopoly on the legitimate use of force to prevent the civilians at large. Is the Afghan nation at that point? Is it in the position to do that? A lot of Afghans have doubts about that. And just to make sure that people understand, you cannot understand how Afghans feel about the US withdrawals until you realize what happened to Afghanistan in the 1990s. When the Soviets left, throughout the 80s, the West recruited bin Laden, recruited Islamists, jihadis, urged them to come to Afghanistan. Said, come to Afghanistan, fight along your Muslim brothers, we will give you weapons, we will give you money, we'll train you, CIA, Hikmat Yar, all these people. When the war ended, the Americans left, the West packed its bags and left. They said, our national interest, security interest has been served. It is no longer in our interest who runs Afghanistan. And they abandoned Afghanistan, and it fell victim. All the guns, all the weapons, all the trained militiamen, all these brutal people had been trained by the West to fight against the Soviets. They were still around. They still had their gun. They had massive power. They started fighting each other. In the 1990s, a horrible civil war broke out in Afghanistan. The same people that we supported to fight the Soviets now fought each other. They turned their guns onto each other. And the upshot of that, as usual, the civilians suffered, women and children especially. 50 to 70,000 people in Kabul alone died in this war. It was a period of complete anarchy, looting, rape, murder, killing, snipers shooting at bystanders. Kabul divided into different sectors. You crossed an invisible barrier. You had trespass into another warlord's section, and then they would just shoot you. Going out to get a bottle of milk became a life-risking endeavor. The Afghans remember those days, and what they fear the most, even more than the return of the Taliban, is a return to the anarchy of those days and to the rampant violence and the impunity of those days. And they fear that if the Afghan state cannot protect them and the Westerners leave, everybody's going to pick up their guns and it's going to go back to the 90s, and that's terrifying to them. Wow. That's where it's coming from. That's why if you look at polls and you ask Afghans, do you support the presence of the foreign troops, the polls are overwhelmingly yes. Not as overwhelmingly now for a whole slew of reasons. But a poll in December of 2009 asked this very question. 70% of people said we favor the presence of the troops. 60% of them supported the Obama surge. Not because they like having foreign troops on their soil, quite the opposite. We all know Afghans are independent and sovereign people, but they're also pragmatic people, and they understood, at least at that time, and I think they still have concerns about the ability of the Afghan government to protect the citizens at large.
How much faith do you have in Karzai?
Well, if you look at results, you have to have your questions about his leadership. I think the Afghan people are right to demand a government that represents them, that is legitimate, that is transparent, and a government that provides them at least with the basic services with security first and foremost. They're right to demand those things. That is the job of any government. And it's very difficult because a lot of Afghans don't feel the government has done its job quite right. You know, but we also have to understand, again, there's another side to the story, is that yes, it's easy to say, well, look, Karzai is not good and the government is full of corrupt people. But everything has a context. Let's think again where Afghanistan was. Before all the wars, Afghanistan ranked at the very bottom of the global index for human development. Okay? Then 30 years of conflict, okay, of displacement, of complete, where traditional means of justice were eroded, where there was no functional economy, where it was the law of the gun, where 8 million people, that's a third of the population of Afghanistan, were uprooted and lived as refugees. Okay? Today in Afghanistan, average life expectancy 45 years, 46 years. 1 in 5 children dies before the age of 5. Okay? You have 70% illiteracy. Okay? And given this reality, is it surprising that the Afghan state is struggling? Okay? Is it realistic for us to say, look, you know, elections are coming up next year. Why don't you develop a functioning society, get an economy, and a legitimate government, and we'll get on our business. Okay, state institutions take time to develop. Post-conflict states take decades to return. This is not a 40-yard dash. This is a marathon. Nobody wants to hear that. Afghan story is a marathon. And so, that's the kind of time frame we're talking about.
You know, I hope that in the same way that Americans now travel to Vietnam on vacation, that the day will come that people would consider visiting Afghanistan.
They
That'll
should.
be built to the point that
They should. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful country. You know, I was at a book signing once, and the lady walked up to me. She goes, "I didn't know Afghanistan had trees." Oh, I said, quite seriously. And I don't blame her, because the only pictures we see is caves and guys squatting like this with, you know, the blankets, and kind of shifty, cagey looking guys, you know, and just there's always dust blowing, and there's some Chinook helicopter landing. It just looks like a looks like a hellhole. I don't blame him. The truth is, Afghanistan is stunningly beautiful. If you go to the north, it's lush. You have amazing forests, woods, rivers, orchards, gorgeous, gorgeous landscape. It has its mountains and deserts, of course, and everybody has seen those. But it's just a beautiful place. The Afghan tourism industry, hopefully, if things settle down, could possibly do very, very well.
We're going to lead a tour.
You know, it could do very well. I see sometimes I see these faded old posters of European backpackers back in the 70s walking through Afghanistan, and you know, I hope those days come back.
I hope so too. I hope so too. You know, I think it's why is it that we have never seen pictures of lush Afghanistan? I mean, Afghanistan is in the news all the time.
Because we tell one story, is, you know, how many people died in the suicide bomb, you know, where was there an attack? We tell the same stories, and also some of the lusher areas of Afghanistan, thank God, have been not so much involved in the insurgency. They've been traditionally, at least the last 10 years, they've been relatively safe. The real hotspots have been in the south, where the terrain is a little bit more rugged.
I agree with you, though, what you're saying about, you know, the media tells one story per country, and you know, and I know it's like with me, people always say, "I can't believe you're funny," and I think, well, do you think that people only laugh in the West? I mean, anyways. What are you working on now?
I'm working on a third book that's coming along. You know, I've been working on it probably for close to, you know, a year and a half or so. It's fiction, and it's partially set in Afghanistan, and that's probably all I should say. Not to be like Mr. Highfalutin artist or anything, but the reality is I'll tell you the book is about this, and then a year later, it turns out it's like something about altogether different. And so I learned my lesson. You know, there's a lady showed me a book of a paperback of a kite runner. On the very back page, it says, coming in spring of 2006, the new book by Khaled Hosseini, Dreaming a Titanic City. You know, and so I learned my lesson there. The book did not come out in 2006, and it was not called Dreaming Titanic City. It was called A Thousand Splendid Suns. It came out a year later. So let's leave it at that.
Okay, okay. I'd like to open this up to questions. There is going to be a microphone, so raise your hand if you have a question, and somebody will run to you with a microphone.
I wanted to ask if you would comment on the female characters in A Thousand Splendid Suns, because you depict all of them so brilliantly, and given the sort of hiatus that you had from your time as a child to when you returned as an adult, what were the inspirations for you for the characters?
Well, for me, when I wrote A Thousand Splendid Suns, the single most important thing I wanted to do was to lend what had become a cliched image, namely the Afghan woman in burqa walking down this dusty sidewalk with 5 kids trailing her. I wanted to take that familiar image and explore it, because beneath that cloth there's a unique human being, a person who is an individual, and of the 5 billion people on earth, there's not a single other person exactly like her. Even if she may be faceless, even if she may have disappeared under the burqa. There's a unique human being with an individual set of experiences, with individual desires and hopes and sorrows and disillusionments and so on and so forth. There's a complex human being underneath that thing, and I wanted to say, well, who is that person? And that was the reason I really wanted to write this book, is to say, you know, we shouldn't just look at this and say, up, another Afghan woman in burqa. That is a person, and that's a very important leap to make. Neither Maryam nor Layla were based on a single person, but my trip that I referred to in 2003 when I went to Kabul, I met a lot of people. And back then, security was very relaxed. There was no suicide bombs. It was unheard of. You could walk the streets and there was no problem. So I walked endlessly and I spoke to people. I wasn't conducting research or anything. I just was curious. I just wanted to drink it all in and just speak to people and just hear their story and come to a understanding of what had happened in Afghanistan on a human level. And so I asked shoemakers on the street, guys who were fanning kebab skewers, you know, women who worked in schools, who worked in NGOs, beggars on the side of the street, their stories. And what I learned through that experience was the tremendous struggle that particularly the previous 10 years, the 90s, had been for women. And not only had they been victimized by the sort of the ubiquitous brutality of the militias and the Taliban, but they also have been victimized by gender-based violence, by rape. Women had been stories of women who'd been raped as booty, or as a way to intimidate a family, or as just you know, reward. Women who'd been forced into marriage. The story I heard was a commander saw a young woman on the street. This is up in Kunduz, apparently. It was in Kunduz. And she was 15 years old. So he decided he was going to marry her. So he went to her parents' house with his thugs and said, I'm going to marry your daughter. And the father said, well, you can't, because she's engaged to her cousin. He lives in Amsterdam. And so she's already engaged, and they're going to marry in 3 years. And he's like, you have to break the engagement because I'm going to marry her. And there was this back and forth, and while they're talking, the girl's younger sister, who's 12, comes in to bring tea and sweets and so on, and he goes, okay, I changed my mind, I want this one. Okay, so these are sorts of stories that I heard, And so neither character is based on one individual, but rather as based on the collective voices that I heard and their creations out of my understanding of what happened in Afghanistan.
His question is, what did the Russians want when they invaded Afghanistan?
Look, when I lived in Kabul, it was very interesting because the 60s and the 70s in Afghanistan was actually a very good time for Afghanistan because Afghanistan is in a very strategic position. The Afghans call their country the heart of Asia because they're right in the center, and that's been both a gift and a curse, as you well know, because throughout the centuries, armies have marched across Afghanistan and tried to colonize it and so on and so forth. And in the 60s and 70s and also the 50s, Afghanistan was the beneficiary of the push and pull between the East and West. The French would build a lycée, and the Soviets would go and build an apartment complex. And the Germans would say, aha, we'll build a hydroelectric plant. And then the Soviets would say, okay, we'll build you an airport in Kandahar. You know, each side trying to get bring Afghanistan to their fold. And the Afghans were the beneficiary of that, peripherally. This is a long answer, but basically in 1978, there was a coup d'etat in Afghanistan, and the Afghan president was murdered, and the Afghan Communist Party, one branch of it, took over. And it was vastly, vastly unpopular. Of course, there were puppets of the Soviet regime, and they lost control of the country very quickly, and by December of late 1979, the Soviets understood that we're going to lose Afghanistan to this uprising, and so they took matters into their own hands and rolled in, and then the rest, as they say, is history. And that war, you cannot understand anything about modern-day Afghanistan without starting with this. Everything about Afghanistan today that we talk about starts with the Soviet war. Virtually every problem that Afghanistan has today is a legacy of that horrible decision.
Who was the microphone? The microphone's broken? Well, I'll repeat the question. Let me just start here because I can hear. Mona, what's your question?
I want to ask you both, having lived in the US now for 10 years or 11 years, what's scarier to the average American, Iran or Afghanistan? Because it seems to me you turn on the TV and these are the two demons basically that constantly come up. So what's scarier, you think? And your positions as basically stereotype busters of this horrible demon.
So her question is, which country do we think is scarier to Americans, Iran or Afghanistan?
You are. You're scarier. I'm scared of you.
Yeah, I think we're number one on the wrong list. But I mean, we have Ahmadinejad. Man, he's hard to top. You know, and I just want to say this: every time he comes to America, every Iranian holds his breath. So,
you know, Afghanistan is. I don't think there's ever been an international Afghan terrorist, although there was a guy in Colorado who was arrested. You know, I think for most people now, Afghanistan has become more a burden than a monster, something that they're afraid of. It's like, how do we unshackle ourselves from this war that's been going on for 10 years and this massive financial and human resource burden? I think that's more how people see Afghanistan today. I don't think people fear Afghanistan. I think they're more concerned about Pakistan and Iran.
yes.
I was just wondering, can you please speak on the process you took in creating the plot of your stories? How much of the story did you actually already have in your head versus how much you had to create during the process?
Okay, so let me kind of like answer the question from the standpoint of the Kite Runner, the first book, because I don't outline anything. I mean, I've met a lot of writers, and what Rabi said the other night on stage when he said no two people have the same approach is completely true. But I've met folks who outline exhaustively and know exactly where the story is going, how it's going to end. It's a matter of just getting there. That's never worked for me. I like not knowing at all what's going to happen. I began with an idea of these two boys who are friends and kind of, it turns out, brothers, but and living in the same household. And I knew something bad was going to happen between them. and the dynamic was unequal. The one was the more powerful, affluent boy, and the other one. And then let's see what happens. And every morning I sat at the computer really not knowing where I was going, and then things would just kind of pop up. I had no idea how the book was going to end. I knew that there would be a return to Afghanistan down the line because it seemed like the right thing to do intuitively. And it really wasn't until I got there that I realized why he would go back and what would be the upshot of him going back and so on. No idea how it would end. I didn't even know that the two boys were brothers. And if that's a spoiler for those of you who haven't read the book, I guess you deserve it for not having read it. I remember one day my wife was, and I kind of burst in. I had it was like this image from a movie. I was like half shaven. I had the razor in my hand, and I ran. And Roy was like, "What?" I'm like, "I think they're brothers. I got it. I think they're brothers." And so I rewrote the second draft as the two kids being brothers. I guess half brothers. So anyway, so that's my process. I feel that if I know where I'm going, I'm robbed of the surprises and the spontaneity and the possibilities that are there. I feel boxed in, and my writing just ends up flat. And I really like not knowing where I'm going.
I was curious, how well known is your book in Afghanistan, and what do Afghan people think of it?
My books are well known in pockets. You have to remember that most of Afghanistan is rural, and in rural areas, illiteracy is particularly high. So people have, besides having the problem with illiteracy, have far more formidable challenges in their daily life. Shelter, food, water, education, healthcare, surviving day to day, and that the reading of novels is really a frivolous idea. And so there is virtually no recognition whatsoever of me in a lot of parts of Afghanistan. Now, when you go to Kabul, and you're among urbanized professionals, there is much greater awareness. The bookstores in Kabul have my copies of my book in English, and all the pirated Iranian published copies as well. And so in that region, in the cities, much greater awareness. The reception, as was the second part of your question, is a little bit complicated. For the most part, I think it's been very positive. And Afghans see the success of the mainstream success of these books as a point of pride in the community. And also that they recognize their stories on the pages of these books. They say, that happened to my cousin, or this is exactly what we went through. Thank God somebody's telling this story. For the most part, that's been the reaction. And I get a lot of really encouraging letters from my fellow Afghans. For others, it's been more complicated because especially the first novel, and to some extent the second novel as well, talk about issues that are difficult to talk about in Afghanistan, the idea of ethnic rivalry. Everybody knows it's true. It's not that they deny that there isn't ethnic issues in Afghanistan. It's that it's family business. Don't air out dirty laundry. Let's keep it in-house. Why are you telling the world about this? That's more the criticism that I've come across. But I've always believed that the job of writers to be people who write precisely about those things that make people uncomfortable, that make people have a dialogue, that challenge people's perceptions. But if I were to sit and write about Afghanistan the way some of these folks would have me write, as this proud, happy nation full of proud, happy people living proud, happy lives, I mean, that's like propaganda. It's not fiction. It's not worth my time. So I won't do that. Can you answer the same question?
What was the question?
The question was is your book known in Iran?
My
How is it
book,
received?
actually, my first book, Funny in Farsi, is a huge bestseller. I am much more well-known in Iran than I am in America. And in Iran, if you sell 2,000 copies of a book, it's a bestseller. And my first one has sold 100,000 copies. And unfortunately, the government has now stopped all printings of it. And they have, because it's too popular and it makes America look good, So it's not allowed anymore. Oh, Iran is not part of the international copyright laws. Surprise. And neither is Afghanistan.
No,
Yeah,
I got a nice email from a Iranian publisher that said, we've translated your book and we're publishing it. We just want to let you know if you'd like a copy, we'll be happy to send it your way.
That was nice. I mean, I've never made 1 cent from a book sale in Iran. So, I mean, my luck. I have a bestseller in a country that doesn't pay. But
I said Godspeed.
yeah, that's. Yeah.
My question is, in The Kite Runner and in the PBS documentary that's more recent, many of us were particularly moved by the plight of the dancing boys.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you are seeing in Afghanistan some movement in terms of the protection of children that's parallel to the progress in women's issues.
Yeah, I mean, that has to happen. That's just one of the shameful, dirty secrets that people don't want to talk about, and that I kind of raise in The Kite Runner, in that there has been, particularly in the south of Afghanistan, in the Pashtun regions, this tradition of pedophilia among men who are married and have children and so on. And that's something that has gone on for a long time. I don't know how prevalent it is, but I do know that it does occur. And you know, a lot of Afghans were embarrassed when that documentary came out, and they were there was this kind of this sense of you know, let's you know, kind of close shop. And I think it's good. I think these things should be out in public. You cannot bring about social change if you're not even trying to talk. If you're not even talking about the things you want to change. And so I think bringing these things out in the open, I'm not aware of any campaign to specifically address that, but I hope that with these sorts of you know, news stories and with these stories coming to light, there will be pressure to have to do something about it.
A personal question. I was delighted in your second book to read about Murray, which is where I was born. And I wonder how well you know it. And also, I've always wondered if it had similarities to Aspen.
I actually, Murray is a resort town, I guess, in Pakistan, which is apparently now, I was speaking to Daniel Muinuddin the other day, and he said it's become a mess. He would be the fellow to really ask this question. I wrote about it, but I actually have never been there. My wife used to go there with her family, and throughout the course of our marriage, she would always describe it to me and how beautiful it was, and she had so many happy memories of going there. And so I used that, her stories about Murray to create this kind of idyllic temporary existence for Layla and Tariq while they're contemplating what to do with their future. But I really hope I get to see it someday. It sounds like a lovely place.
After you released, or before you released the movie, The Kite Runner, there was some concern about the safety of the actors, the boys. What's since happened to them, and can we expect another movie?
The boys were, nothing ever happened to anybody. Nobody got hurt. The concern was that there might be potential for something happening, particularly to the boy, the Hazara boy, who had played the role of Hassan. The studio took some preemptive actions to make sure nothing would happen. They, the actor who played Hassan and his family and his 6 other siblings were taken to Dubai. And as I understand it, the studio agreed to pay, to get employment for both parents and to pay for the education of all 6 children until they're 18. So they were well looked after. I must confess, that was back in 2008 when this was kind of decided. I haven't been in touch with the boys in about at least 2 years. The other boy who played Amir, I understand, was also in Dubai and eventually just ended up going home. His aunt was very homesick, and he was as well, and they went home. And as far as I understand, nothing's ever happened. Another movie, quite possibly, yes. It seemed quite dead for a long time. Sony and Scott Rudin kind of had the book, had optioned it, but nothing came of it. But there's a very good script that's been written by Steve Zalian, who's possibly the most influential screenwriter, one of the most in Hollywood. He's written Schindler's List and won the Oscar for it, a number of other books, other screenplays. So he's written a screenplay, and plans are afoot to find a director. It seems like financing is in place, so suddenly it looks like the Thousand Splendid Suns movie has been resurrected. And so,
Good. Well, we look forward to seeing it.
yeah, well, we'll see what happens. I detach myself from the process to the extent that is possible, because I see it as a whole other entity, separate from me, separate from books.
There's a...
Did you ever consider writing the screenplay yourself, and kind of what thought process went into that for The Kite Runner and also Thousand Splendid Suns?
I wasn't asked to write it, and I'm kind of happy I wasn't asked, because I would have had a difficult time doing it. I forget which writer said that a screen adaptation is like a controlled act of vandalism. And so it would have been like chopping off parts of your own body, vandalizing your own home. How do you do that? How do you go through the story that you've put in so much time and effort, and say, okay, so I'm going to get rid of this, I'm going to get rid of that. Better let somebody else do it. And so I did not.
Were you able to actually have a say in it, though?
Well, writers and say, you don't really have a say once they own the rights to the book. It's really their property. I mean, as long as they don't turn it in, it's like Glee Kite Runner or something like that. As long as it's not something completely absurd, they can pretty much do what they want with it. But the writer who wrote the Kite Runner script is a lovely guy. His name is David Benioff. He's a very successful screenwriter in Hollywood. Now he's writing Game of Thrones now. He's got a very nice gig going. And he writes at night, and I would wake up in the morning with like emails from David now and then with questions about culture or language or one thing or other, and I would just answer it. But that's the extent of my involvement with the script.
Do you have currently a trip planned to Afghanistan?
I don't know, but I'm sure I'll go back in due time. I've been going back once every 12 to 18 months, averaged.
Are there any other questions? Well, I want to thank everybody for coming in. Khaled, thank you, as always.
Thank
always
you.
a pleasure.
Always a treat to hang out with you.
Thank you, Khaled.
Firoozeh and Khaled, I'd like to talk to you for a second. Thank you so very much. This is the last festival event of this year, so thank you so much for really just, wow, an amazing week, and for allowing us to celebrate the literature of the Middle East. Both Funny in Farsi and Laughing Without an Accent, and of course The Kite Runner and A Thousand Splendid Suns are available for purchase. Please let both of these authors, wonderful authors, get to the lobby so that they can sign books. I know you're all you have dinner reservations, so we do want to move people through. And again, thank you all for joining us. I do encourage you to check out the Khaled Hosseini Foundation. It's a wonderful organization, and we're proud to hopefully partner a lot more. So thank you so very much, everybody. See you soon.